Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast, part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. 1517 just recently concluded one of its conferences in Northwest Arkansas. That is our Here We Still Stand regional event in Northwest Arkansas. If you were unable to attend that and you're interested in some of the talks there, you can subscribe to 1517's YouTube channel, and then you will have access to those as soon as they come out. That conference was about baptism. It was a very good conference. We also had a podcast pre-conference, and so you will have the opportunity to listen to some of the audio recorded there as well. Remember, subscribe to the 1517 YouTube channel in order to get those videos as they come out. Today, I am joined by Dr. Adam Francisco, Dr. Scott Keith, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse. She is the founder and president of the Ruth Institute. She's also the author of many books, the latest of which I read recently, The Sexual State, How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. I believe my dad read it as well. It's a very interesting and good book, I thought, and so we're glad to have you on the show. How are you doing, Jennifer?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm pleased to be with you guys. I've been friends with Missouri Synod Lutherans since my very first book, when Issues, Etc. started having me on periodically as a guest. So I'm long time buddy with Jeff Schwartz and Pastor Todd Wilson.
Well, we're great to have you on. I said that you're the founder and president of the Ruth Institute. For our listeners who might not know, what is the Ruth Institute? What's the mission, and what are you guys up to today?
Well, the Ruth Institute is an international interfaith coalition to defend the family and build a civilization of love. And when I say interfaith, I mean it. We do our best to present traditional Christian sexual ethics as the universal good that it really is, So everything we do is in keeping with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, because that's where it all is in one place. But the truths are universal, and so we try to reach out to as many people as possible. And so most of our work, my background's actually in economics and social science. So at the Ruth Institute, you will see us go at things more from that perspective than from a theological perspective. But we're always prepared to talk about that if people want to. But we kind of start off with, look around people, look around at what is happening to us. Every deviation that we take from the tradition, the broad Christian tradition on these matters, is leading us into further and further crazy territory of destruction to, literally millions of lives have been destroyed by various aspects of the sexual revolution. And so on our staff, we have, over the years, we've had people from a variety of Christian traditions as part of the staff. And we have, at our conferences, we've had people like sociologists and therapists and lawyers and doctors, all talking about the different aspects of social life and a society's life that are impacted by the rules that the society adopts for itself around human sexuality and child rearing and all of those related questions. So that, in a nutshell, that's who we are. That's what we do. Like I said, my doctorate's in economics. I taught economics at the university level before our children arrived. Our children are a very interesting part of my life story because I had we had a bout with infertility, my husband and I, and so we adopted a boy from a Romanian orphanage in 1991. He was 2.5 years old when we got him, and then 6 months later we gave birth to a baby girl. And that was the experience that launched me into the reality that kids really, truly need their parents, because the things that we had to instruct our son to do were things that our daughter did automatically, and so you just start to see, holy moly, we're acting like the family, like children are potted plants, and you put them on the shelf and you water them once in a while, and they're going to be fine. It doesn't matter how many different caregivers they have, or whether mom and dad switch out their partners a million times during their childhood. We're treating this all in such a cavalier manner, and so as my children aged, and we did foster care for a while, so we have all of that kind of experience in the mix too. I started to see that this was maybe my new vocation, once the kids were launched from the home, that I could use the training that I have and the skills that God gave me to shed this type of light on these type of questions. And I have to say, you asked what we're up to. Caleb, I will tell you, the Ruth Institute will never be out of work. We might not always get paid for our work, but we will never be out of things to talk about, because it's endless at this point.
Yeah. And that really does bring us to the topic of today's show that listeners probably clicked on, which is the sexual revolution and its consequences. And you've touched on it a little bit here, but I think it'd be good to sort of ask the question, what is the sexual revolution? People have ideas from maybe a social or historical political background about what the sexual revolution is. I think there's some basic definitions out there too about sort of the norms of public sexuality changing and things like that. But in your books, you give a much more comprehensive sort of definition, and I think for Christians, which would be a much more frightening definition, which is that there's some sort of system at play here. It's not just a social accident or social progress towards some different sexuality.
Right. So I define the sexual revolution as basically being three interlocking ideologies. And before I spell these out, I want to just mention that I came up with these over the years that I was defending marriage. So starting in 2008, the year I founded the Ruth Institute, I stumbled into Prop 8 because it was happening in my backyard. I was living in San Diego at the time. Proposition 8 was the California ballot measure that said that amended the California Constitution to say marriage is the union of a man and a woman. That all got started in San Diego. I didn't really want to get involved in gay stuff. In fact, I don't know anybody who wants to get involved in gay stuff. But I didn't feel like I could sit it out while this debate was going on right in my backyard, because I could see, I only could intuit it. I didn't fully see it, Caleb, but I could intuit that if you redefine marriage, you were going to end up redefining parenthood, and the net result of that was going to turn out to be harmful to children. So over the years, and it was literally years, when I was out and about debating, like at least once a month, sometimes once a week, and I kind of refined these points, to kind of figure out what is this all about? Why are they so committed, and why am I so not committed? Why do I continue to think this is really going to be a disaster? So all of that is to say, I broke it down into the kind of the three big ideas that seem to me to be driving that ship and driving a lot of other things. And those three big ideas are the architects of the sexual revolution have a vision for society. They have and I kind of call this the sexual constitution. There's a Christian sexual constitution that establishes the rules of the game as to who's allowed to have sex, when you're allowed to have sex, when you're allowed to reproduce, what does it take to get married, all of those type of, what do you look for in a spouse? All those type of things. Every society has rules about that. We're kind of pretending we don't have any rules, but every society has rules and a philosophy around that kind of stuff. And the Christian sexual constitution is pretty much shot. It's gone, and it's been replaced with the revolutionary constitution. And the architects of that new view of human sexuality, they have three big ideas. First big idea is that it's a good thing, and a good society should separate sex from babies and do everything possible to separate sex from babies. And I call that the contraceptive ideology, which is separate from the pill. A lot of times people will say, the pill changed everything. And I want to say, the pill is an inanimate object. It didn't do anything. We did something with the pill and with the ideas we created around it and so on. So that's one point. Separate sex from babies. That'll make us happy. That'll be good. Mm-hmm. Second point is do everything you can to separate both sex and babies from marriage. Marriage is outdated. Marriage is oppressive. Marriage is unnecessary. I call that the divorce ideology. And when we talk about the divorce ideology, we don't just mean divorce proper, but other practices, other social practices that separate, that destabilize the relationship between children and their parents. Okay? So it could be unmarried parenthood, could be third-party reproduction, where you purchase sperm or eggs, something like that, which is a radical separation of a child from one parent. So those are the first two. Then the third one is the gender ideology, what I call the gender ideology. And that's the idea that a good society should view the sex of the body as being somehow unimportant. We should be able to overwrite the sex of the body if we want to. So early on, when I first started talking about this, I'm thinking about feminism, I'm thinking about homosexuality. Now we have the trans thing in the mix, right? Which is, an even further extension of that idea. And so the early feminists, the feminism that I grew up with in the 80s and stuff, it was all about, men and women are really the same, and any differences between men and women should be wiped out using the force of law, okay? And then you have the whole homosexual movement, which is saying the sex of the body is irrelevant for reproduction. It's irrelevant for your choice of sex partner. And now we have the trans movement saying it's just irrelevant. If you want to change it, you can, And so all of that, I refer to that, broadly speaking, as the gender ideology. And that challenges, nature, reality, science, and in a very fundamental way, but we've gotten used to a lot of the parts of it, And so you take those three things together, and what you end up with is a worldview which says you get to do anything you want sexually, and nothing bad will happen. Nothing bad will happen to you. Nothing bad will happen to anybody around you. All those things that were telling you no, 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 including the Christian church, of course, that was all unnecessary taboos. We have to outgrow that, and so on and so forth. That, to me, that's what I call the sexual revolution. So your opening shot, Caleb, it's about sexual promiscuity. In a way, that's right. Right. But there's more aspects to it, and it's deeper than that. So that's how I would start.
Yeah, and go for it, guys.
Interesting to me. I'm just keep talking. Interesting to me. I just finished your book as I was driving to Arkansas here, which was great. I had some questions, some of which are probably good for the show, some of which are probably good for email. But it came on the heels for me of a series of books that are dealing with this in a more roundabout way. And it's kind of funny. You're first to, separate sex from babies. I mean, we're running into this sort of, I'm always reticent to use the word crisis, but I'll call it a crisis of childlessness and sort of eventual depopulation because of the lowering birth rates. And, I finished reading What to Expect When No One's Expecting by Jonathan Last, which is a great book.
It's an old book, but still relevant, huh?
And it very much is dealing with the repercussions of, what happens when you separate sex from babies to society that you don't even know is going to happen. You're not even foreseeing it. And then you kind of have the separate sex and babies from marriage. And I finished reading the book Get Married. I'm trying to remember the author's name here.
Brad Wilcox.
Brad Wilcox.
Yeah.
It's great. And it sort of lays out all of the myth that exists in society, and that's been promoted, especially to sort of the millennial and Gen Z generations, about the benefits of not getting married, kind of coming on the heels of the original, maybe baby boomer and Gen X sort of inheritors of the sexual revolution, kind of what they then taught their kids. Because true for me, I'm sure it's true for you and true for Adam. When I was growing up, still in the 70s and 80s, this stuff is there, but it's sort of making its way into a solidified ideology. By the time you get to the 90s, it's a solidified ideology for sure, which means that any kid born in the 90s or later, they grow up with this sort of quote unquote sexual revolution as not a revolution, but as just what the world is, a sort of worldview norm. And then you get, I love these people coming along and saying, well, what you've been told about all of the things about marriage that are negative and the downsides is, let me give you some data. It's just not true. And then just finished reading, Tim Carney's Family Unfriendly, where he does the same thing about having a family and all the horrible things you've been told about having a family. And he turns all that on its head. And I mean, if you just sort of take in all of the information in your wonderful book, you kind of leave it and you're like, oh my gosh, is anybody going to see the light here? And at the end of the day, it was nice for me to have come off of some of the other books too, where people have seen the light, and I can even say that in the last couple years, because I wrote a book in 2016 called Being Dad, which is an encouragement for people to become fathers and to be good fathers. And it was probably, in a lot of ways, it was probably written a little early, because that's picking up, that whole idea is picking up way more steam now than when I wrote that book. And it's this can all be a very discouraging conversation, and it is. Like, I mean, it just seems to like bedlam, it's just getting worse and worse but there are also some bright lights shining through that weren't even a few years ago, and which can be kind of encouraging. I mean, it's encouraging to hear people do all the data on everything you think is the world regarding marriage that you've been taught your entire life, probably even by your parents, by the schools, by the state. I loved the connection to the state in your sexual state, by the way. Absolutely. I mean, but it's wrong. Here's the data. It's wrong. All the stuff you've heard about the downsides of marriage,
You're wrong.
You're not going to have as much fun in sex. You're not going to enjoy it as much. You're going to have less money. Here's the data. I mean, just straight up data too. It's wrong.
Yeah.
Everything you heard is wrong. Yeah. Everything you heard about how horrible starting a family is, and go through every point, it's wrong.
How impossible it is, how it costs too much,
It's so there's part of this that, it's just, you look at the news and the social medias and you just think, oh my gosh, is this ever going to stop? And then you can get some glimpses that, well, maybe there are people like you doing good work on this, and Tim Carney and Jonathan Last, doing good work on this, and hopefully they're changing minds. And I think you guys are. I think y'all are.
Can I ask my question now?
Yeah,
go for it. Sorry.
Was that a question, by the way, Scott? Was that a question?
It was. That was. I'm kind of like you. I'm the boss. I just get to have running commentary.
Yeah.
Just insert them wherever I want, and have the people that work for me go, What is he doing?
But thank you for your kind words about the book.
Yeah.
And in my experience, when I write a book, I talk about it. Then it takes me like 5 years to write it, to figure out what it's about, and then I talk about it for another 5 years, and I figure out what it was really all about.
Yeah,
I talk to people over 5 years.
100% the same way. I said,
yeah.
It took
me. I want to hear from Adam. Come on.
It took me 20 years to write Being Dad, and it's because I wanted to get my oldest to the point where they were, pretty successful before you write a book called Being Dad. You don't want to be caught unawares by children that are horrible when you write a book like that.
The whole book, it hinges on if my life goes up or down. So it's like a lot of pressures.
Oh, it's you. No pressure, kid.
Yeah, no pressure.
Pressure's good.
This is I'm a history guy, so this won't surprise Scott or Caleb. But do you refer to the architects of these ideologies? I'm wondering, like, how far back do they go? Is this 1960s and 70s, or is this like Frankfurt School kind of era, 1930s, 40s? Is it Rousseau or somewhere in the middle there? Or like, who are the big movers and shakers, especially the ones that are not just thinking these ideas, these revolutionary ideas, but actually use put to purpose their ideology?
Yes. Well, since you're a historian, you'll appreciate this. Everything, it goes back to Adam and Eve, honestly, do you want to get right down to it? I mean, there's the working out of original sin in this one whole area of disordered sexuality, right? And we can now see that when sexuality is not properly ordered, it's chaos. I mean, it's really chaos. It weasels its way into every nook and cranny of life, But to answer your question in a serious way, it does for sure it predates the 60s, of course, because the 60s people didn't come out of nowhere, But most of the people that I talk about are from, I would say, more from the 30s. So I talk about Wilhelm Reich. I don't know if you're familiar with him. A lot of people are not familiar with him. He's a German figure, in my opinion, a nut job, a complete whack job. Yeah. He actually wrote the book called The Sexual Revolution. And he predicted, oddly enough, that it would take off in America. Okay, in the 30s, he's saying that it would be a big thing in America. That's where it would really take root. And I still don't completely understand that. But anyway, he had the idea that repressed sexuality was terrible. that if you didn't let people do what they wanted sexually, they'd become fascists. This type of non sequitur. Okay. I suppose you'd have to say Freud is in the mix, in terms of redefining human sexuality. We'd have to include that. Although he understood that limits were constructive. He had some sense that that constraining people could be socially productive. So I talk about Reich. I talk about Kinsey for sure.
I was going to say in your book you really make a Kinsey connection between the sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female.
That's right, and that was the 40s. Okay, his first book came out in the 40s, and of course Margaret Sanger is in the mix as well. Yeah. But the thing that I say in the book that I think people don't necessarily, wouldn't necessarily put together has to do with what Scott said, which is there are people in our world who think there are too many people. Okay. And so John D. Rockefeller the third is one of the first people who's really, oh my gosh, there are too many people. I think he got stuck in a traffic jam in India once or something,
Yeah, usually some sort of colonial racism experiment as well, where they go to a country with lower standards of living than the West and see people everywhere and connect that it's too many people. I forget what book I was reading, but that idea went back to
that was what happened with Ehrlich and what resulted in population bombs.
Yeah, sure. But there was even some Christians who did it in London, hundreds of years earlier, who associated that Christians had slower population rates, and that's why they were more civilized, and so some of these other portions of the world were less civilized because they keep populating.
Mm-hmm. Well, the long point that I draw out in my book, and this is my economics, I have his interests in history, but my mind works like an economist. The amount of money that the billionaires have pumped into the ideology is truly staggering, okay? So John D. Rockefeller III was one of the first to really say there's too many people in the world. What can we do about it? He started by spending his own money with private foundations that he created to, encourage people to have fewer kids. And we've got to control the population. We've got to do something about it. But over time, what he and his fellows, fellow rich people did was to encourage governments to spend their tax dollars, incentivizing lower birth rates and stuff like that. And honestly, one of the big in addition to that, the Rockefeller Foundation, which is the generation before John D. Rockefeller III, they are the ones who financed Alfred Kinsey. I mean, if it were not for the Rockefeller Foundation, you can go to their website today and you will see them bragging about how, we financed this great, brilliant, beautiful research that's so important to everyone. I'm telling you, if it weren't for the Rockefeller Foundation, Kinsey would be a 2-bit bug doctor with a masturbation problem that no one would have ever heard of. I mean, they promoted him and they're still proud of it. And don't get me started on Kinsey, but he made it sound like everybody's doing it. Okay, so the GIs came home from World War II and found out that everybody's having affairs because Kinsey said so. Because Kinsey took biased samples that were not representative and drew general conclusions about the whole population. This is a standard trick, by the way. This is how data is manipulated. And at the Ruth Institute, we are looking for that all the time. And it's still going on. It's still, that the whole debate over gay marriage was conducted in this manner, to be honest. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little hyper about this. But the point is, these billionaires have pumped literally billions of dollars into the society, convincing people, number one, that there are too many people, and then doing things to systematically reshape the incentives. And it was in 1974 that John D. Rockefeller III, figured out that talking about population control was not getting anywhere. People were creeped out by that. They thought, and I've got chapter and verse in there, Latinos, Black people going, what the heck? We don't want anything to do with this. He figured out in 1974, he gave a speech at a conference that he sponsored. And he basically said, what we need to do is empower women. We need to educate women. Because he figured out somehow that if you educated women, then the cost to them of having more kids would be too high because you invest in all this education stuff. And this is where we are today, right?
Yep.
The richest women that have ever existed in the entire history of the human race can't afford to have kids. Well, that's all their opportunity cost. They've invested in all this education and whatnot, and they can't bear the thought of staying home with their babies, even though in their hearts they want to stay home with the babies.
Yeah, the desired rate of how many children women say they want to have prior to having kids is still the same as it essentially was in the 1960s. I think it's still like 2.6 or something like that it averages out to. While the rate itself is dropping way below, 1.6.
And it has become a weird...
So like my pal...
Hannah's children, yeah.
My buddy Catherine Pacolic is a fellow economist. She's the mother of 8 children. She wrote this book about women who have large families, educated women who have large families. And that point you just made, Scott, 100%. You look across the world, you look across countries, and you ask women... when they're 20, how many kids do you want? You ask them when they're 45, how many kids did you have? And desired fertility is always higher than what they actually achieved. There are millions of heartbroken women who have not had as many children as they wanted. Millions of us. Millions, okay? Nobody ever talks about that.
And the data corruption is the same with Paul Ehrlich. He was literally disproved, I think, in several debates, less than a year out from writing his book, and yet it made it into the universities as required textbook for still to this day, even though it's shown to be completely bogus. I mean, from top to bottom. I was going to say that I tried to remember who were the initial funders of Margaret Sanger too, and her sort of initial birth control movements. John D. Rockefeller Jr. is one of the big ones, and the other one I think is the daughter of like the original Procter and Gamble family or something like that.
Not quite. You're close. Clarence. There was somebody from the Procter and Gamble family. I want to say Clarence Gamble, but I might be wrong about that. But yes, the other person was Catherine McCormick, the Chicago heiress from the McCormick Reaper Company and whatnot.
Yeah.
There's a book floating around called the profiles for people who changed the world. It's this big love fest for the people who made the pill possible and stuff. But of course, Catherine McCormick is one of them. In addition to Margaret Sanger.
Forget the forced sterilizations of women in Puerto Rico.
Oh, yeah. The thing that you that was brought up a minute ago, like the fact that the United States government still funds population control efforts all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not just by funding birth control efforts in our own country, which is egregious enough.
No, if you want aid, you need to get on birth control. If you want vaccines, you need to get on birth control.
And it leads me into, our listeners will have heard me sort of drop this bomb and not explain it, that, one of the big things that just drives me crazy about the world in which we live, and you brought this up at the end of the Sexual State book, I was so glad to hear it, is that at the end of the day, these are just all anti-human movements. It's an anti-human movement. It's this sort of this view that humanity is a corruption onto this good thing that we call the earth, and it's got to be, controlled to this. I think about birth control. It has to be controlled to some great extent, because if you let it do what God intended it to do, it's going to take over and ruin this thing that is supposedly supposed to be protected. And without even any, once you've destroyed all ethics, you can't even give a reason why the earth should be protected. And we try to extrapolate that out into, why I shouldn't have babies is crazy.
Yeah, we talked about, it was in the recording order. I don't think it'll be in publishing order. In the last episode, we recorded, the fellows here, we did a Doctrine of Creation sort of episode.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and on the Hoppy Horse there, too.
And, well, one of the things that's interesting is the identification of humanity as a plague theologically. It could really have something to do with what you said earlier, Jennifer, about, this problem working itself out all the way from the beginning with original sin, right? That people do have some sort of sense of sin and human and what humans are doing in our sin and our corruption of the world. But apart from the Christian faith, the solution is nothing but destroy yourself. There is no redemptive solution. And so in some ways, there are lots of other issues at play. And even I think the economic ones are extraordinarily interesting because it actually does help move this worldview into, say, Christian lives as well in ways that it doesn't from just the sexual ethics perspective. But the solution is always non-redemptive. And really only one of the premises of your book and of the Ruth Institute is the church has always had the correct ethical answer, but it also has the correct perspective that allows it to have that when it sees a corrupt world, which is it has a redemptive answer to the problem of sin and human destruction.
And we should know better. We should be able to be alert when somebody's talking to us like this, that there's something wrong with what they're saying. And I do think that's why at the Ruth Institute we have followers from across the religious perspective, even when, like, as you guys know very well, every religious body today has problems with this area. People inside the denomination, the Roman Catholic Church, we've got problems at the wazoo. All the denominations that have schismed and separated from one another and divided over these issues. It's huge, but we should know better. We should be able to recognize what's wrong with what the world is offering. But I think I want to endorse what you said, Caleb. I think a lot of people in the modern world understand that the human condition is troubled. They understand. That's correct. They're right about that. But they have no idea what to do about it. And so what happens is that the person who figures it out, there are problems here, somehow they exempt themselves from being part of the problem, and they put themselves above everyone else and say, well, we're going to fix this if we just sterilize enough people in India. Well, so that'll solve our problems or something, or some other, equally illogical thing.
And egregious.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Right. My daughter, I'm going to just say my daughter went to school at Berkeley because we used to live in California. She got in-state tuition to go to Berkeley. She was president of the Students for Life Club. I just want you to know she did not lose her faith at Berkeley. But she took a public health class from a guy who was an old-time, unapologetic population control guy. Mm-hmm. And he would get in there, day in and day out and just rant. He's like Paul Ehrlich, 45 minutes at a time, day in and day out. And even the non-religious students were like, this guy is a nut,
It's enough.
He used to show up wearing a tie that had condoms on it and bragged about the fact that he had himself performed vasectomies in train stations in India. It's like, the mind reels. I don't know about y'all, but the mind reels for me,
that sounds more like the way guys talk in a locker room or something, rather than something that really happens.
Well, there is that. That is possible. But it is, nonetheless, it is true that an enormous amount of harm has been done to people spiritually and psychologically by having their fertility destroyed, and the trans movement, I do think it's kind of interesting to note that the bottom line of the trans movement is to sterilize people. If you go through with all these procedures, you're going to end up with, girls who have no uterus and boys who have no capacity for, people who've made eunuchs out of themselves, and the billionaires are financing that. So you draw your own conclusions, people. But I think that the one reason, people ask me what's the most important part of this thing, the contraceptive ideology, I think is the most toxic in a way, or the most significant, I guess I put it this way, because the money behind the contraceptive ideology has financed so much of it.
And it's the easiest to personally adopt without a lot of lifestyle change, right? What
do you mean?
Where you can engage in contraceptive sex, like detaching sex from babies very easily in your own life versus, the homosexual agenda or other things. It just sort of can naturally happen and you're incentivized to do it. Like you said, when you get to, girls are incentivized to do it so that they can have fulfilling lives through career instead. Right. Or, men are incentivized to do it for economic reasons as well. You can't afford to have a family yet. You need to get into a stable place to consider before you consider these things. And so it's just it's sort of stuffed down your throat from an early age, and then it's just second nature, and it justifies all these other right things to do in life. And that's kind of my fear for Christians as well, is that they don't tend to completely adopt these 3 points that you said, especially when it gets to sexual ethics kind of questions. But because of the economic opportunity for people, they will sort of adopt long-term use of contraceptives, even in marriage. You might even get Christians who encourage young people to get married, but then encourage you to wait 5, 6, 7 years until you have kids. Right. And it's just part of doing things correctly. Well, we want you to be able to buy your house on your own and be economically stable and not need your mom and dad for help and all this stuff. And so then this whole other piece, family life, gets put as a secondary or tertiary thing in life instead of a primary fulfilling factor or the primary command to creation.
Right. Be fruitful and multiply. It's the very first positive commandment, isn't it? I would put it this way, Caleb. I endorse everything that you said. I mean, I totally understand, where you're coming from with that. But here's what I would say. The sexual revolution is intrinsically seductive. And I think if I could leave your listeners with nothing but that point, let that be the one point. The sexual revolution is intrinsically seductive. It's telling you get to do whatever you want and nothing bad will happen. So that's an implied promise, right? And so if you don't specifically resist it, you'll be swept away by it. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of the churches. You have to intentionally resist it because we want it to be true. In our fallen, broken, original sin hearts, we want that to be true. And we're quite capable of resisting an enormous amount of evidence, that it isn't true. And as you pointed out earlier, I think it was Scott who pointed it out earlier. We've known this evidence for a long time. From the very beginning, we had inclinations as, this is not really going to work. The data's been there. Yeah, it's been there, and, people ignore it. So for two reasons, I think you need to see that the sexual revolution is intrinsically seductive. Number one, so that you won't be swept away by it. And number two, when you are talking to other people about it, you're trying to persuade them of the comprehensive Christian worldview, you need to understand you're asking them to give something up. This is the core thing you're asking them to give up. This belief, which to be a fantasy that is untrue, it's not really going to work, but you're asking them to give that fantasy up, and they're going to be reluctant to do that. And I think if you have that in your mind, it'll help you in those kind of minute to minute conversations as that shifts around, because you'll see it. I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast has had this kind of conversation. You try to explain one thing, and you think you're getting somewhere. You got the data, you got the experience. You're trying to help a person connect the dots between the fact that they're unhappy and something that they've done, and they change the subject. So they're kind of skating away from that body of evidence and on to something else, so that they can kind of hang on to being part of the new modern world where nothing bad happens except to me. Those people on TV, they get away with it. Why can't I get away with it? And
they all look so happy.
They all look so happy. Yeah.
The data says they're not, but they all look so happy.
That's right.
Yeah.
On that point about data, you mentioned the social sciences a bit peripherally and directly. It seems I spent almost 20 years in higher ed, and while I met a few really good social scientists who were inductive in their approach and conscious of their biases, they tried to stay away from ideology. It seems so many of the social sciences are compromised, are driven by an ideology.
Numbers in search of a conclusion, or conclusion in search of numbers.
Yeah.
Junk science.
Yeah.
And yet they're so popular. I get myself in trouble when I refer to the natural sciences, the real sciences, and then there's the social sciences, and it's kind of a joke. It's not funny to a lot of people, I guess, but it is to me, so I keep saying it. But
I think it's hilarious. To me, anytime you want.
What's it going to take to recover, or are the social sciences so compromised that if, let's say you work at a university, that maybe it's a live options just to cut off the social science disciplines. We tried to do that at a university I once worked at, because they were so, like, to a person in the social sciences was so ideologically driven by a materialism and all sorts of other isms in a Christian environment. And we held on to this, maybe it was a fantasy, as you pointed earlier, that there's got to be some good real social scientists out there looking for jobs for $30,000 a year.
You're one of the richest neighborhoods.
I can't wait for the job offer to roll in.
Yes, the public side of this, the political side of this, all seems to suggest that the modern vision for sexuality, social relations, and so on is supported by all the data. You say, and there are other organizations, that say that's total hogwash. Mm-hmm. What would it take to change public discourse on this?
Well,
obviously everybody sort of rolled their sleeves, but is there something big?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And that's one reason why, when I started off in this area, I spent, pretty much all my time correcting social science and explaining. People would call me up and say, "Dr. Morse, did you see the study that proves lesbians are the best parents ever?" And I'm like, it's 6 a.m. in California. I'm like, well, if you read the darn thing, figure it out. I can sort of predict what the problems are going to be. But I mean, I've been in this a long time, and it's occurred to me, gradually over this period of time that we have to go past the data into the sort of understanding of how the world actually works. We have to get from the physics to the metaphysics. You shouldn't need a study to tell you that you can't change a boy into a girl.
Right. That's just such a good point.
We should not be doing these experiments on small children, period,
right.
Full stop.
Or that if you do, you don't need a study to say, if you try to do this, bad things will happen. Like, this should be fairly obvious to most reasonable people. The problem is, reasonable people don't seem to exist. Yeah.
But here's the thing, the big thing I want to say in response to Adam, and that is we're losing science too.
Yes.
I mean, I hope everybody understands that. I mean, it's
we just did a show on it.
Did you?
No,
good.
Yeah.
Good. Because, the woke medicine is now a thing. The public health departments in our country are not playing it straight with us. And, a lot of people felt that after COVID, but pro-life people have known that for a long time. We've been watching them fudge data, and change the questions that they ask and stuff, We're losing science, we're losing technology, we're losing medicine, all these things that modern man is so proud of. We're turning them, we're idolatrous towards them because we don't have them properly ordered with respect to the whole rest of the cosmos, which is it's not just about us and our ability to manipulate nature. It's about us in relation to God, to whom we owe our existence and to whom we owe worship, and when that basic equation is upset, we try to put ourselves on the throne, and that's the basic problem. It's going all the way back to Adam and Eve. That's the basic problem, and the modern world has done that in spades. And so yes, it's a problem. It's hard to find honest social science because all the incentives are wrong now. It's hard to get a job and keep a job, and all of those type of things that we, I'm sure your listeners could tell us about from personal experience, what the ways they felt they had to keep their head down and so on and so forth. Well, that's what I would say about Adam. I don't know if that answers what you were concerned about.
Yeah, it does. One more question before Scott jumps in again. He's ready to pounce. But on the other side of things, so let's say this is a real practical question. You mentioned you fostered and things like that. Let's say you're somebody who's like, well, I want to, I got some free time, free money, something like that. I want to do something to help out, whatever that might be in this sort of arena. And so let's say you choose you're going to adopt or foster or something. I think of the foster system in particular. I have a little bit of experience in there. And you go into it with these noble intentions, and you learn very quickly it is an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like there's zero hope. Mm-hmm. And it's sad and so on. what's the practical thing that a Christian can do to help?
Well,
it is a big. I really loved your point about this is a worldview issue. Like it's not just the physics; it's the metaphysics. But what's stuff like real concrete stuff people can do in addition to raise having their own family, or is that the answer?
Well, I mean, look, the sexual revolution has corrupted pretty much every institution in society at this point. And so that means that's discouraging in one way, but in another way, it means there are many fields available where you can make a difference. So whatever your profession may be, whatever your gifts and talents may be, there is undoubtedly some place where you can put them to use to block bad things from happening, to blow the whistle on bad things that are happening. And from time to time, we write about this at the Ruth Institute. And I hope people will subscribe to our newsletter and, keep up with us, because these things, they pop up periodically. For instance, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was this big hubbub over State Farm Insurance sponsoring these books that were genderqueer books or something like that. Well, the only reason that came to anybody's attention is that somebody inside State Farm saw this going down and leaked it. And leaked it to one of the watchdog outfits. And the watchdog outfit made a lot of noise, and then State Farm backtracked.
I guess I got to change my insurance.
Yeah, too.
State Farm's cool, but my point is that it's risky to do something about it inside the professions, but it's also absolutely necessary. If you're in the healthcare field, there are alternative professional societies that are alternatives to the American Academy of Pediatrics, so the American Medical Associations. There's a society of, I forget what they call themselves, the Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. There's the American College of Pediatricians. Whatever that is in your field of endeavor, you need to find those people and be part of what they're doing and magnify their voices, because
pay dues and keep them going.
Pay at the very least, pay dues. At the very least, pay dues, or find an outfit like ours or like this organization, and send money periodically. Yeah, that's how we position ourselves with respect to our donors. Look, we're fighting your fight. This is your fight, and we want you involved. And if sending money is what you can do, well, that's great. If you can, write a letter to somebody once in a while, or you can share our materials with people, that's even better. And because we need all hands on deck. I mean, John Paul II once said, "It is not permissible for anyone to be idle." And I certainly think that's true. If you get what's going on, you need to find some way to contribute. But you can't be, Adam, here's the other part of it. You can't be discouraged by the big picture and how dim the big picture looks, because you cannot deal with the big picture. No one can. No one person can deal with it. So you have to pick out your thing that you're good at, that you're passionate about, that you know something about, whatever it is, pick out one thing and go for it, and just hang on to it like a dog with a bone, and don't let it go.
And for listeners, I think that really, can play out in some of the circle of vocations episodes we've done. We've done a bunch of these where your family comes first before you go out to the whole world. Right? You can talk about that when it comes to missions. You can talk about that when it comes to Christians and good works and all sorts of things. And you have these, if the big picture is causing you anxiety and makes you want to do something, the place to start is your family, your community, your workplace, etc. And those vocations start there. I think because we're getting kind of close to time, or a little past it, so we'll just keep going. But the big thing I hear that I think listeners should hear too is that everybody has been affected by this. We likely have all participated in it at some point in our lives too, in this ideology, that it's pervasive, and that there's a lot of people, as you said, who sort of are enticed by it and living it because it has this false promise behind it. And so there's also the people who are out there in our Christian communities and outside of it need reintegration into the community when this happens too. And I think as Christians, that means there's sort of also a demand here on us to have the gospel forward as we have these personal conversations with people who we know are hurting, right? So the data says they're hurting, but we have an actual particular thing, or we know that this is anti-human, and we have an actual answer to sin for them too. And so part of the reintegration is not just giving people advice as to what to do to change their life, but also bringing them back to the fold through forgiveness, through grace, through the extension of these gifts that Christ has given us, then too, so that you can bring them back into the family, into that circle that's not just the world.
Oh, I think that's really, really important. And I think a lot of people intuit that and are doing that in various ways, trying to, like, for example, there's a whole branch of the pro-life movement that is dealing with what we call the post-abortion syndrome or post-abortion regret or post-abortion stress and so on, trying to help the women and men who have participated in something that they now understand was wrong and harmful, and to bring them back, to bring them along, And so I think within the body of Christ, there are many people who will be really, really good at this aspect of it. We at the Ruth Institute, we deal with the problem of clergy sex abuse, if you can imagine such a thing, which is, one of the most awful things ever. And I keep telling people, look, if you can extend your sympathy to somebody who's been victimized and listen to them and be a friend to them, you can't do anything about what's going on in Congress or Hollywood or the Vatican or, maybe even your parish priest you can't do anything about. But you can do something to console the victim, to reach out to tell them that you believe them or that you hear them or that they still are part of the community. And some people, I have no doubt at all that there are people listening today who will be really good at that kind of thing, and not just about sex abuse, because there are a lot of victims of sex abuse from across the board, right? There's more of that than anybody wants to talk about, but also people who have been involved in some kind of sexual sin, pornography addiction.
Even people who feel like they've missed their shot on a family, right? They followed this into their late 30s and they have, guilt or think that they're going to miss out or regret. Yep.
Broken heart, to be friends, I think there's a whole ministry of friendship. But you can't start from the position of I'm right and you're wrong. That's a whole, trying to explain why things are right and wrong and, win arguments and stuff like that. That's a whole different kind of vocation.
Well, I think
that the church needs both. The church needs somebody to be, on topic, in the mind, talking like that to be as just as clear as possible. But you also need people who have some gift for healing and for extending themselves and for sympathy and compassion and that kind of stuff. Because what you said earlier, Caleb, is really true. At this point in history, most people have been both victims and perpetrators in some way of the sexual revolution. I have. I know I have. There are a few people who haven't, but, a lot of people have, and sometimes it takes you a while to work out. Like, I thought that was okay, but it turns out it wasn't really okay, that type of stuff. So I don't know. There are no 100% satisfactory answers to these questions, but I do think there's a satisfactory direction, and if we put ourselves in the right direction and stay united to the Lord in prayer and stay accountable to one another and try to be honest with ourselves, well, then you can make progress. But the idea that somehow we're going to make it back to the way it was when we grew up, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to live to see that. And discouragement is always of the devil. I mean, that's a principle from, I've heard that from any number of mystics, sometimes anger is fine because you need justified anger. Sometimes fear is appropriate, but discouragement is never good, right? So you can't give in to that.
Well, guys, Adam, Dad, do you have any closing thoughts? I mean, it makes me think of the kind of the quote you brought up from Kolb before about sort of
being part of the family,
and then the change. But yeah,
well, there's a section in her book where at the very end where Dr. Morse says something that I think a lot of women should hear. I know I've wanted to say, and I know Caleb and I have talked about this, but it's essentially that it's really okay. And earlier you were talking about the opportunity cost for women and having families, and they invest in these educations, and then they don't want to miss out on, making use of their investment. But that it really is okay to go and get an education and to then use that education for the benefit of your family and children.
Yeah.
And that's not a wasted education.
Yeah.
And I think if because I'm very much start small and deal with the people that you actually know and can talk to and have relationships with, to make change, especially if individual churches and pastors and the church in general could sort of wrap its head around teaching its young women this, instead of, would you call it in your book, a man in a, teaching women to grow up and be men in skirts?
Yeah, I could have said that.
That it's really important to know that. Like my wife went to college and she never really had a job. She had part-time jobs to help us make ends meet through the years, but her primary job was raising the kids and educating the kids. And Caleb's wife went to university, and Adam's too. And this has been their primary job. This has been the primary way in which they've used their education. And there's probably no more honorable way to use your education. And if we could start teaching that, as the alternative, not where you're saying, sort of the 1950s, in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant, and the negative connotations too, but really that's a really positive outlook for women. And then even in the book you point out, and then when your children are grown, use that education and that degree and those qualifications, they didn't leave. Right. You still possess them. And then this is, if you would like, this is when you can start really thinking about diving into them. And so what? Your career was 25 years instead of 40 years, and it's who cares? And I mean, I just think it's really important to, and I guess at the end, I'm just really encouraging people to read your book. Maybe especially women who are kind of struggling with this, because I can say that and it doesn't matter. I went off and got multiple degrees and then I had a career. And so maybe I'm just a hypocrite in that sense. But hearing it from you is different. So,
yeah, when I was reading your book, I literally texted my wife and said, every single one of your sisters needs to read this. Now, even though they're all getting married, having kids, etc., that they want sort of traditional lives, but it just felt like information that I could go mansplain to them, or but there was sort of an organic way of somebody who experienced that opportunity cost, etc., in a way that I can't say because you have the career or whatever.
So kudos.
Well, I appreciate that, fellas. I really appreciate you saying that because, and that's what I thought the Ruth Institute was going to be about when I founded it in 2008. I thought it was going to be telling women that that motherhood was a noble thing. You weren't going to lose your mind. You aren't going to become stupid. It would be okay to start a family sometime before menopause. That's what I thought it was going to be. And then Prop 8, changed everything in my life. But I really appreciate you fellows saying that because I think people do need to hear it. And I've lived long enough now that I can credibly say, I raised my kids. I left a tenured teaching position to take care of my kids. My friends thought I was crazy, and of course in academic life, if you walk away from a tenured position, you might as well shoot yourself in the head, because you're never going to get another job like that, and it's been fine, it's been fine. But the thing in the background of that is the stable marriage, because if you're afraid your husband's going to cash you in for a younger model, you can't invest in each other in the same way, you know what I mean? I mean, you can see how that's the threat of divorce hangs over every marriage, no matter what. You really can't overcome the legal setup that we all inhabit, and this is a great example of the sexual constitution, by the way. That marriage is not, in fact, a lifelong, permanent, sexually exclusive union. It's not. And you can't change that individually, no matter how great your faith is or anything like that. So the fact that my husband and I had enough stability that we created ourselves, and that I was willing to say, well, okay, maybe he could leave me. It's theoretically possible that he could leave me, and then where would I be? But oh well, I'm going to go for it, because it seems like this is the right thing to do. And of course, we have a better marriage now than we would have if I had been arguing with him over doing equal chores in the household, which is how we started our married life, because that's part of the package, of being a career woman, is your husband is supposed to, toe the line and do half the household stuff. Otherwise, he's being unfair and oppressing you and all this kind of nonsense, So I can testify for sure that doesn't make you happy.
Well, I mean, before we end, I just want to thank you for being on the show. I could do.
Yeah, we could probably do 5 more of these.
5 more shows like this. So I really
well, that's great. Well, I appreciate you fellas. I appreciate you having me on and listening to an old papist like me, That's what you provided you guys on the 1517 podcast. About lose my Catholic card over here hanging out with you guys.
Some of us will see you as a sister in Christ, so that's how you got a family.
There you go, fellas. There you go. Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. To our listeners, thank you for listening this week. If you are a new listener to this show, you can subscribe in your favorite podcasting app or wherever you listen to podcasts already. You can also go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of 1517 shows. There's over 20 shows there now, and you can even find Thinking Fellows episodes there, new and old. I'm going to, when I edit the show, go through, try to find all of those books that were mentioned. There were a lot mentioned in this episode, so I'll do my best to get them all and put them in the show notes. I hopefully don't miss too many of them. So you can look in the show notes for links like that, and also links from other things that are going on at 1517, as well as I'll put a link to the Ruth Institute and their newsletter, as Jennifer mentioned earlier. So we will make sure that all of that is in there if you're interested and want to keep up on these topics. We thank you for listening. We will catch you next time. Bye.